Hello and welcome to Starting Over with Shannon. This is a podcast about fresh starts, new chapters, and embracing change and challenge to become a better version of ourselves and create a better world around us. I'm your host, Shannon Jenkins, and every week I'll be bringing you a different starting over story with tips on how to conquer life's difficulties to find greater joy, meaning, and purpose. I'm telling you straight right now that this is the kind of episode that you should take notes for, because I have got a brilliant expert lined up for you who is here to explain how you can stop this vicious cycle of self-sabotage and clear the way to lasting happiness for yourself. So our guest is triple board certified and licensed clinical and forensic neuropsychologist and university professor, Dr. Judy Ho. She legit has something of an 8-page CV full of fancy credentials and amazing achievements, half of which I don't understand. But you know what I love even more? That she can distill all of this important research and present it in an easy to understand, actionable and relatable kind of way. And that's what we actually need, right? And I honestly have found that this is quite a rare find in the academic world. So this episode is absolutely for you if you are just, quite frankly, fed up of getting in your own way in life. In fact, I'd argue this episode is for everyone, because even if you think that you aren't the type to self-sabotage, you'll probably realize that you are. You might be thinking, oh, gee, thanks, Shannon. You're here to tell me that I have yet another problem that I didn't know I had. No, so don't worry. This episode is not here to just make you feel terrible about yourself. It is here to empower you to better understand yourself and to give you simple, easy, practical strategies that you can implement starting from today. And in fact, I want to give you one right away to really hone in on that. And I've been experimenting with this myself since we recorded this episode, because if I'm getting honest with you, I have been the type of person who self-sabotages. And before I even had a word for that, I didn't know what self-sabotage meant. I just knew that I would have times where I'd reach for that extra glass of wine to self-soothe and avoid, or to not set goals for myself because I was afraid of not reaching them and then feeling even worse. So I just avoided doing that altogether. Or I would not turn up to social events because I didn't feel like I was on it or like the best self that I thought I needed to present to the world to be accepted and loved. Well, that's you too. Well, like I said, we all have different ways, but the practical strategy that I want to give you right now that you'll get the full details on later is as simple as this. When you notice that you're feeling an uncomfortable emotion, pause, rewind the tape and ask yourself, what was the thought that came before? What was I thinking right before I felt this? You'll honestly see how effective this is for getting out of negative spirals and gaining some distance from that rogue brain that we all have sometimes, right? But more on that later. So I want to go over to this conversation with Judy. But before we do, I just want to say a huge thank you to those of you who regularly tune into this podcast. As I've said before, we're now in the top 10% globally, and that is just blowing my mind. And I'm so grateful and so excited for all to come. And also, if you're new here this week, a big, big welcome to you. If you think that self-development, spirituality, and inspiring stories are your kind of thing, pause now and click follow wherever you are listening to this. And if you have been inspired or moved by an episode before, I would love to hear from you. So please do leave me a review over on Apple Podcasts, because I love hearing from you and connecting with you. And it makes me feel like I'm not sitting here by myself on the other side of the world. So I'd love to hear your stories. But with no further ado, here is our conversation with Judy. Judy, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Starting Over with Shannon. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while because I think it is a topic that so many people find themselves in without even realizing. And I just came across this meme that I think was getting passed around the internet in the last week or so. And it was this meme of these two birds digging a hole, and one of them was digging a hole and taking the sand out, and the other one was then back dropping all of the sand back in, and it was like actual footage of me doing the inner work. This is also me trying to do this healing, and then also me self-sabotaging. So I was like, that is I'm gonna have to share that one. But I realized how many people identify with that, right? Getting in their own way.
Absolutely. And I think that it's so simple because oftentimes we miss it. And we sometimes even call it out by name. We say that we're getting in our own way. We say we're self-sabotaging, but people oftentimes say that and then they shrug their shoulders and they walk away without a solution. And that's really a big impetus for why I wrote the book.
Yes. Did you also write the book because you got in your own way, or is this just realizing that it's a thing for other people?
Honestly, I think that self-sabotage, it's universal to some degree, and it's just how big of a problem it is in your life. And I have just noticed that, first of all, it was such an issue with the patients I was treating, with my family members and friends and colleagues that I was talking to. And that's where I started to get the sense that this is really a universal problem. And certainly, especially in my 20s, I felt like my personal form of self-sabotage was probably procrastination, because I really looked at procrastination as actually a way to motivate myself. But that is definitely getting in your own way, because when you wait till the last minute to do something, even if you have the best ideas, you just don't have the time to execute them properly. And that's really a hard lesson that I learned. I remember during grad school, thinking that waiting till the last minute was actually going to be helping me with my work quality. And then I really did have a huge bomb where everything just like completely went to pieces. And that was when I was like, you know what? I do not think that this is actually the best way to keep going forward. But it was something that was really hard because I had built a different beliefs of what procrastination was doing in my life.
Yeah, I so resonate. I think I've fallen into that same trap for myself, as I'm sure a lot of people listening too. So what's your working definition of self-sabotage?
So my working definition is getting in your own way despite your best intentions. And that can be about anything. That could be about your romantic life. That could be about your work and your career. That could be about your friendships and your family relationships. That could be about your health and wellness goals. It can really be about anything. But most people, I find, do not self-sabotage in all of the areas of their life. They self-sabotage in like one or two areas, but the other areas are seemingly going kind of fine. So, or maybe even great. And so that's why it's so inexplicable, because on the one hand, they obviously have shown the propensity to be able to reach goals and to have that motivation and that drive. But then for some reason, there's one or two areas in their life that's just not coming together. And self-sabotage is really the key to unlocking why that's happening.
And what is the difference, would you say, with laziness or poor self-discipline? Or do you hear that a lot? People saying, well, isn't it one of those two things? Aren't we just having this blanket idea of what self-sabotage actually is?
Yeah, I think that when people say that it's actually an issue of maybe willpower, then what we're not understanding, willpower is not something that a person is born with per se. It's just a skill set that we can all work towards. And sometimes we're taken off of that track because we don't have the self-belief that we can accomplish it. So these negative messages that we tell ourselves is why we sometimes say this is laziness, or this is just something that I don't have and other people do. I think if you really focused on what was beneath the self-sabotaging actions, everybody has propensity to have the strength and the conviction to reach whatever goals that they want to.
Yeah. So why are some people then more likely to self-sabotage than others?
I think there's really a lot of different reasons that underlie self-sabotage, but at the very root of it, it's really about the fight or flight switch being activated more often and more frequently and more severely than it needs to. All human beings have two primary drives, and those drives are to attain rewards and to avoid threat. And when those two things are in balance, then we're thriving. It's basically the two drives that allows us to survive as a species. But sometimes, and for different reasons, people oftentimes will find that that threat switch gets amplified higher and higher. And when that happens, you're more focused on all of the reasons why you shouldn't be moving forward and going for rewards rather than really keeping those two things in balance. So when that threat switch gets activated too often, that's when self-sabotage occurs. And in our everyday life now, that threat switch isn't necessarily for most people about a physical threat. We're not running away from saber-toothed tigers so much anymore, but emotional and psychological threat is just as significant to our brains as physical threat, because really we need both to survive. We need to feel physically and mentally and emotionally well. And that social piece of it, that emotional piece, the reason why that threat is interpreted the same exact way in our brain as a physical threat is because we need both to survive. And so your brain has not evolved to differentiate between them because emotional threats are real to your brain. And that's why it is so important to understand that it's an easy thing that can happen to anyone because it's already built into our biology and our evolutionary roots.
Yeah. So then would you say that people working on their stress response is a key part in overcoming this?
Definitely. And I think it's also about really understanding what that threat response is telling you, because oftentimes when that threat response occurs, people try to push it away because it's uncomfortable. And by pushing it away, you're not really examining it and overcoming it. And it just leads to a cycle of avoidance and repression, which really isn't healthy and certainly leads to self-sabotage more and more. So it's not really about trying to push away the feeling of being afraid or threat. It's about accepting it and understanding where it comes from and then being able to manage it. But I think that a lot of people are just trying to completely ignore any negative sensations that come up, and that actually makes the problem bigger. It's really about recognizing the value that all emotions have for you, and that includes your fight or flight responses.
Yeah, I see that. Are there any ways, people might be familiar with the common forms of self-sabotage, like you say, procrastination in your example, or, overeating or substance use, misuse. What about, are there any sneaky ways that it shows up that people get caught? They're like not even aware that they're doing it.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes it can come up when you just tell yourself that you can't do something, so you don't even make it a goal, right? So there's the kind of self-sabotage that happens when you commit to something and it's a goal of yours, and then you don't reach it, and then you get really down on yourself for it. And then there's the kind of self-sabotage where you don't even set goals for yourself, or you set very minimal goals. You don't really reach far enough, even though it is in your heart's desire to do that. So I think that that's some of the ways in which it can be the sneakiest, because you're telling yourself, oh, I don't really even want that. But truly, you actually do if you were honest with yourself. And a specific example of this could be someone who says, oh, I'm way too busy for a relationship. I don't really need anybody anyways. And not recognizing that deep down, they really do want that connection with another human being, because all of us do. Whether that connection is one of romantic or not, we all need human connection. But I have definitely worked with people, even seen it in my own family members and friends, who say, it's okay, I'm just a lone wolf, I don't really need anyone. But truly underneath all of it, they do, and they're just not even giving themselves the opportunity to say, this is a goal of mine.
Yes. So what is that an avoidance of, really?
I think it's the avoidance of what happens when you actually reach your goals, then what's going to happen next. I think that there's a lot of different reasons why people are afraid, and we can, of course, get into that. There's not really one blanket reason for every single person, but for a lot of people, they're afraid of good things happening. And they have to contend with whether or not they really feel like they deserve it, or when good things happen, then there's that pressure, like, how do I maintain it? So there's a lot of different things that can come up for people that drives them off of even setting a goal in the first place.
I actually love that you mentioned that as a point, because it's one that's often overlooked, the idea of people fearing success and all that comes with it, because we often focus on the opposite of that, which is a fear of failure. So
right.
Yeah, I like that you illustrate that. Walk us through the concept or the acronym of LIFE and what that
So
is.
life is a way to find out what your underlying self-sabotage drivers are. And for most people, they might say, there's a combination of these four factors that are at play for me. Or maybe for some people, they'll say that there's really only one or two of the four that apply to them. But in all of my work and my studies, I found that the four pieces of this acronym generally apply to everybody in one way or another in some combination. So there is a quiz that I've devised to help you find out what your drivers are, what your life factors are. It's available for free on my website at drjudyho.com, so you can check it out there. But essentially taking the self-assessment step to understanding which of these drivers apply to you. And the acronyms are created in a way so that you can really understand what each factor is and how it might apply in your life. So L of life stands for low or shaky self-esteem. And this is how we feel about ourselves and our ability to achieve things in life. And self-esteem is not necessarily the static thing that applies to you globally. Sometimes people will have good self-esteem in certain areas of life, but not such good self-esteem in other areas of life. So they might have really good self-esteem when it comes to their romantic relationships and their friendships, but they have lower self-esteem when it comes to their career. So that could be one of the self-sabotage drivers. I stands for internalized beliefs. So internalized beliefs are these ideas that we get from our childhood. It's these things that we think about as children because we're exposed to it from the adults in our lives or from our environment. And as adults, we actually start to internalize some of these ideas and they become our own. So one example would be a parent who maybe is really cautious, seemingly anxious all the time about what could happen that would be bad. And maybe as a child, you even found that a little annoying or irritating. But then as an adult, you realize, oh my gosh, I'm adopting some of these ideas for myself. And now it's making me afraid to take any chances. So that's just one example of how internalized beliefs can play a role. F stands for fear of the unknown or fear of change. So as human beings, we don't love change as a species because we need to feel like we can control our environment and what's going on around us to feel safe. And it's also a key to our survival. But there are certain personality types that have a harder time with change and the unknown than others. So if this is describing you, then you might be a person who is driven by the F's in life. And then finally, E stands for excessive need for control. So this is for all of my people who are lovingly described as perfectionists, go-getters, maybe a type A personality. And on the one hand, there's so many benefits that come from that. But if you're the kind of person who can't ever let the reins go and you always have to be in control all the time, or you're not going to take a step forward, you can see how that can hold you back.
How would that hold someone back? Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Because I've had personal conversations with people that don't see that being a problem for themselves.
Yeah, so a good example would be in romantic relationships. No matter how much you want to control something, you can't control how someone else feels about you. And so a lot of times people who describe themselves as these go-getter types, they might say, you know what, I don't really care for relationships. Or maybe they'll get into a relationship where they feel like they can maintain that kind of control, but then they're not really in an equal partnership. And there's that feeling of not truly respecting their partner and not being excited by their partner. That's one example that can happen. Another example would be, wanting to take on a new project, but then knowing that you wouldn't be at the helm of things, that you might have to be a follower in this case. Maybe someone else is leading the project. And then you just say you don't even want to be a part of it, even though it's something that really excites you.
Yeah, okay. I think you're capturing basically everyone. I mean, that's one thing that you say, right? Like there's a universality to this as a message. We all have self-sabotaging tendencies, or overwhelmingly the vast majority, surely.
Right, absolutely. And I think that, again, it's just about how much it's affecting a person at different times in their life. And sometimes it might be affecting you a lot, and other times maybe not so much at all. But it's really about understanding, okay, if this is becoming more of a problem and it's becoming more routine for me, what can I do about it?
Yeah. Well, let's go over to the what we can do about it, because I think that people listening right now, maybe you've heard that acronym of life and you find yourself drifting towards one thing. Like Judy said, you might find that you have tendencies in all of them, but something might strike you. I know for me, mine always came up as a low self-concept, and I meet that barrier in so many different areas of my life. And like many people listening, I want to hear the steps that it takes to overcome this, to move forward, stop holding ourselves back. So Let's go over to that part, Judy.
Of course. So let's talk a little bit about the self-sabotage triggers and how to identify that. So once you know your life factors and you know where the drivers are, then it's really important to understand in situation to situation what's actually triggering your self-sabotage on a day-to-day basis. So what I tell people is that oftentimes they don't realize that everything starts with your thoughts. When something occurs to you, when an event happens, it's the interpretation of that event that really causes you to feel a certain way and to behave in a certain way. And that's why it's so important to start paying attention to our thoughts. But for so many of us, thoughts are super automatic. You're not really processing them, and yet they still are having an effect on your feelings and your emotions and your actions and how you behave with yourself and with other people. And so what I try to tell people to do is to do this very simple exercise where whenever they notice a feeling that they don't like or notice a behavior that they did that they're like, oh man, that is totally self-sabotage right there, I just ask them to basically rewind the tape in their mind and ask themselves this very simple question, which is, what was I thinking just before I noticed this? So what was I thinking right before I noticed this feeling of sadness? Or what was I thinking right before I noticed that I did this action that I wish I didn't do? Like maybe, yell at my coworker or reach for the third muffin in a row when I know that I'm trying to improve my eating habits. And generally, as you do this more and more, you're going to start finding patterns that emerge in your thought process. In my book, I talk about the 6 most common types of themes that come up in people's thoughts. And some examples of these themes are should. So that's the type of thoughts that people have, which means that you're always putting some kind of bar for yourself to meet, but that bar is kind of arbitrary. So it's like, I should have accomplished more today. I should be a better daughter. I should be a better husband. I should be farther in my career by now. But all these shoulds, they don't really amount to much because that bar keeps moving. It's not really a specific thing. It's just something that keeps plaguing you, even if you can't totally label what it is that would make you actually feel like you're doing enough or that you're feeling really satisfied. Another common thought process is comparing yourself all the time to other people. Always feeling like you're coming up short, or comparing yourself to people you look up to and really highlighting what's discrepant between you two rather than, what actually is more similar, so that you can feel like, well, I just need a couple new steps and then I can get there. Generally when people have these social comparisons, they feel like they're not measuring up to some other barometer. So that's another common thought concern that sometimes people can have. And then another one is really thinking that everything is about you, and I say this in the way that when something is going wrong, instead of just understanding, well, sometimes things go wrong, you automatically think that it's something that you did, that somebody is upset because of something you did rather than they're just upset because they're having a bad day. And that can really lead to some self-sabotaging actions, because then you might behave in a way that starts with that assumption. And it can really cause a lot of strain in relationships, or cause you to be hesitant in moving forward because you think that there's some kind of blockade there when there isn't.
Yeah, thanks for illustrating those. I can see myself in a lot of them. I think many of us, as asking you in your professional capacity here, what typically comes first? Is it thoughts or emotions? Because people have differing views on that. And what I'm hearing from you is more that you will have thoughts even if you're not aware of them, and that will then produce a physiological reaction and then re-trigger more thoughts.
Exactly. I think that thoughts come first, although once you get into the middle of the cycle, then it can kind of become like a chicken or egg scenario, because a feeling that you have can lead to another thought, and then that leads to a secondary emotion. So this can just kind of keep going on, and they can certainly affect one another. But I do think that thoughts come first, but people are not paying attention to the thoughts. And that's why sometimes people think emotions come first, because that's when they notice that they don't like a sensation. Right. So the thoughts are kind of just humming along in our minds, and sometimes you just don't pay any attention to them. But when you get stuck on a thought, or when a thought is particularly provoking, it's going to incite an emotional reaction. And that's when people start to register, wait, something is not right. But the thoughts are just churning along, and it's kind of commonplace because you're always thinking about things, and your brain has to make some decisions. Sometimes it's not the best decisions because it's just trying to conserve energy. And so sometimes those shortcuts, lead to mistakes. Like maybe I actually should be processing a thought, but I'm not, right? And it's because your brain only has so much capacity, and it has to always reserve some capacity in case something big happens and you really have to jump into fight or flight and really deal with something major. And so our brains act like little cognitive misers. They're always kind of trying to conserve energy, but as a result, they ignore a lot of things that are going on a day-to-day basis that maybe they shouldn't. And these thoughts that you're consciously ignoring, they're still impacting how you feel and how you behave. And there have been studies trying to track how many thoughts a person has in a given day. The research is kind of all over the place with that.
And it ranges hugely, right?
Ranges hugely, but a good average is somewhere between 30 to 50,000 thoughts or thought fragments. So when you think about it that way, of course, your brain is accustomed to ignoring more thoughts than they would emotions, especially because people aren't uncomfortable with negative emotions. So that's oftentimes what they notice first. But at that point, they're already in an emotionally reactive type of space, and that can lead to further negative thoughts and also actions they wish they didn't do.
Yeah, thanks for that. So going back to your steps here, so you mentioned about like identifying self-sabotage triggers. What comes after that?
So after identifying your self-sabotage trigger, it's really important to learn how to deactivate the triggers and to reset the emotional thermostat. So deactivating your triggers means really understanding how to work with your thoughts. And it's not always possible just to use positive thinking. I think positive psychology has been so amazing, but the idea that you can just maybe think positively and everything will then go well is really unrealistic. And I think that it can lead to this phenomenon that we've been seeing more lately, which is toxic positivity, where it's almost like you're just sweeping everything under the rug and it's actually making people feel worse about themselves when they can't accomplish that. So the idea of how to manage your triggers is really about understanding that there are three major ways you can work with your thoughts in a more effective and practical way. And the first way that I describe is to question your thinking. So oftentimes when we have a thought, we automatically believe that it's true.
Yes.
And it's just the way that language works, right? Like the minute you have a thought in your head, you're like, oh, this is either going to happen or it has happened. And accepting thoughts as reality is part of the issue, because oftentimes we have these negative thoughts. And if we already automatically accept this as truth, then you can see where a lot of problems can occur. And so it's this idea of really taking a curious approach to your thoughts instead of trying to bat it away or trying to argue with it. It's really about being curious about it and saying, okay, what about this thought is actually true and what about it isn't? And in the beginning, it's really important to actually write this down. Literally take out a piece of paper, write the thought that you're having at the top of the page. And then on one side of the paper, label it evidence that this thought is true. And then on the other side of the paper, label it evidence that the thought is not true. And then really ask yourself, what is the evidence? And when I say evidence, it's not more thoughts because that's just in your head. It's about things that other people could maybe observe, people who are around and could actually watch what's happening. So for example, if you wrote down a negative thought that, I'm never going to get a promotion at my job. Well, what's the evidence for it again? So the evidence would not be, well, because I think it, because obviously that's not true evidence, but it's more about, okay, what is actually happening that somebody else can also be an observer and say yes to? So maybe the evidence for this thought to be true could be, well, I've been at this job for 2 years and I still haven't been promoted, right? That's something that other people can observe. On the other side, what is the evidence that this isn't true? Well, I have gotten a really great performance this last round, and I know that my supervisor is taking notice of me, right? So it's these things that are more objective that you can talk about. And generally what people find is that for all of their negative thoughts, there's always two sides to it. It's never all of the evidence is in one column. There's probably evidence in both columns. And once you recognize that, you can move on to the second technique for managing your thoughts, which is to create a more practical alternative thought. So again, the alternative thought is not just to be completely positive, because sometimes that's just not going to feel right to you and you're not going to absorb it and it's not going to work. It's about recognizing what's truly difficult about the situation, but also recognizing something that is hopeful. So I call this the yes, but technique. So yes, recognizing something that's not going so well, and then but recognizing something that is in progress or is going well. So yes, I haven't been promoted yet, but I feel like I'm doing better and building more skills at work every day, right? And so your new alternative thought should be something that you really like you can sink your teeth into, rather than just some kind of positive platitude that just really internally makes you roll your eyes because you don't see how it applies to you.
Yes, exactly. Because something that comes up for me there when you're saying that, and I do completely agree that we need to sometimes reframe the negative thoughts we're having, not automatically see that as being the veritable truth. And yet, the thing with self-sabotage that I've seen is that it's often described as being vicious cycles. And then people would say, well, I have set this goal for myself that I'm going to lose the weight that I've always wanted to. But I feel like I have loads of evidence to say, well, I just can't seem to get it together. And I keep reaching for that extra bar of chocolate automatically and then feeling guilty and ashamed of myself afterwards. So then I can see people thinking, well, I've got all of this evidence to say that I'm not capable. And that just feels overwhelming and like you're doomed. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that oftentimes when the thoughts take over to so hard to deal with it and you're just feeling completely overwhelmed, there's another alternate strategy to working with your thoughts, and it's just to label them for what they are, which is just a mental event. And I think that when people get too inundated and feel overwhelmed, it's because they've really bought into the belief and accepted it as truth, and now they're kind of in a spiral about that. So there are some days where you're just like, you know what? I just am feeling so overwhelmed, and some of the other techniques that you just talked about, they're hard for me to execute today. Then a really simple version of this is just to label the thought. And what I mean by this is when you notice a negative thought, just put this little clause in front of it. And that little fragment of a sentence is, I'm having the thought that. So notice what that does to the original negative thought. So if you were thinking, I'm always going to be a loser, right? Something that's just totally terrible, but it can happen when you're feeling bad about yourself. That thought now becomes, I'm having the thought that I'm a total loser, right? And notice what happens with that. So you're acknowledging that it's a thought, it's a mental event. And it also creates some distance between you and the thought itself. Right? So instead of I am not going to succeed, it's I'm having the thought that I'm not going to succeed, right? It really changes the way that you interact with your own thinking. And then to take it a step further, if you find that you're just constantly rehearsing a negative thought over and over in your mind, it keeps coming up. One strategy I teach my patients is to write down that negative thought on a piece of paper and then just put it in your pocket. And the idea is, I've put this thought on a tangible piece of paper. I put it in my pocket. It's actually with me wherever I go. And whenever this thought comes up, I'm just going to remind myself, okay, I've already written it down. It's with me, but there's no reason why I have to struggle with it. It can actually be with me and literally be a part of me at this moment, but I can still do the things that are of value and of importance to me. And so it's just a reminder that you don't have to continue to rehearse a thought over and over again in your head, because oftentimes people sometimes think that they're doing that and it's almost like a problem-solving strategy, but obviously it's not one that's effective. Worrying about something over and over again isn't actually leading to a solution in this case. It's just making you feel worse about yourself.
Yes, exactly. Something else I've heard, I'd like to hear your take on this, is someone said it helped them to overcome some self-doubt, or at least not play into that to the extent that they sabotage themselves or don't take any action. And it was to, whenever this thought comes up, you would then say, not right now. Mm-hmm. And you kind of defer it rather than ignoring or rejecting its existence. You're saying, I'm not going to act on that right now. I'm going to do something else. My question leading on from this is, at what point can distraction be helpful and productive or unhelpful avoidance?
Yeah, I think that all of my strategies that I just discussed earlier are not really strategies that defer or to try to push away. And I think the reason why I don't focus on those strategies, although I can see how they can work in some circumstances and can be helpful, is because it's a very fine line when it starts to cross into suppression. And when you suppress something and push it away for too long, then you're not actually dealing with the issue, and it actually compounds the issue over time. It's almost like that monster under the bed that you're afraid of when you're a kid. The longer you don't look, the more you think that that monster is there. And you can also have this, crazy imagination of how big and scary the monster is. And then, of course, when you finally check it out with an older sibling or a parent, you're like, oh, there is no monster there, right? It's never as bad as you think it's going to be. So I think the only issue about deferring is, while it could be helpful when used sparingly, it's very tempting to just then never deal with it and never really examine it and understand where it's coming from. And then it's just going to continue to affect you without you recognizing it.
Yeah. Let's come on to your step 5. That I know we've zoomed through some of the others, but something else that's really important to you is that of values. Why is that?
Yeah, definitely. So, we have a couple of steps in between, as you mentioned, steps 3 and 4. These are important because you're really going to examine your behavior patterns, find why you have found yourself in these repetitive behavioral patterns, and then start to change them. So that's really steps 3 and 4. But I think step 5 is a great one to talk about because it's the real reason why you even care about eradicating self-sabotage from your life, right? And I think this speaks to the fact that we're such a goal-driven society. Everybody's always talking about goals, and they're bucket list items. You're doing to-do lists all the time, and you measure your worth through these objectives. And I really think that this is why it's so important to talk about values-based living, because oftentimes we don't keep our values top of mind. It's all about the things you have to accomplish that day, rather than, are you really being the person that you truly want to be? Are you really giving yourself the way to live what we call a well-lived life that's driven by the principles that you want to stand by and the way that you want to be talked about when you're not in the room, and the mark that you want to leave when you're done with your time on earth? And that's really what values are. So values can't be checked off a list. Or not like to-do lists. Values are things that you either decide in a moment to move with or move against. And values are so important because if your values are top of mind, then it gives you the impetus to keep going on a goal when the going gets tough. And you can also make sure that the goals that you're setting actually have some personal relevance and meaning to you. And then when you encounter difficulties, it's much easier to pick yourself back up, and also to accept the negative emotions that are going to come along inevitably whenever you're doing something that's worthwhile. It's not always going to be roses and rainbows and butterflies. You're going to have feelings of self-doubt. You're going to struggle. You're going to be stressed. But you're going to be able to accept all of those emotions much more if you know that it's in service of a high value. So I have a values-based checklist and a values-based card sort on my website. Again, it's free and you guys can download it as a tool. But if you haven't checked with your top values in a while, it's really important to do that. Find what your top values are, and then you can decide, are the goals that I've committed to even aligning with my top values? And if not, then really you should actually re-examine and change those goals. But hopefully what you're going to find is that even when you make mistakes along the way, even when you haven't had the best day from a productivity standpoint, really going back through your day and saying, but did I live my life in accordance with my top values? And if you can answer that with a yes, then you're going to feel better about yourself, and you're going to be much more fresh and ready to start the day the next day. And if you find that you've fallen away from your values, then really recommitting to them in the next 24 hours. So if one of your top values is community, and you say, wow, today I've just been totally isolated and haven't really touched base with my community, it doesn't mean that you have to do something big. Something in service of your value of community in the next 24 hours could just be picking up the phone and having a 5-minute conversation with a family member who you haven't spoken to in a couple of weeks. And I think that that's how values-based living should feel. It should feel very naturalistic, and it should really help you to tap into that deeper sense of joy that people can have, even when they're in the middle of a difficult time.
Yeah, so see that. I mean, I guess you don't want your values to be contradictory. I was sort of reflecting on this going, on some level, I think I have a value of inner peace. I prioritize that a lot. And then I also am seeking excellence and success on some level. And I'm like, how does this fit together? Do you either have to get better at building the resilience to stress so that you can keep the inner peace? And in amongst it, you see, sometimes I think it can feel in conflict and it's hard to know how to prioritize, how to give time to one over another. Do you have anything in terms of actioning that in your own life or something that your clients have shared with you that you could share with us?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, it can seem conflictual at the face, but then when you really think about it from a different perspective, it's probably not as, much of a dialectic as it kind of seems to be at first. And so what I mean by that is, having inner peace can be a very worthwhile goal, even when you're willing to do the things that it takes to be, reaching for your biggest dreams and having that higher standard of excellence. And the way that inner peace comes is through, did I do things in a way that is consistent with my values that are also at the top of my list? Things like building knowledge, for example, that could be a top value of yours, or having integrity in the work that you do. So it may not be that the peace comes directly from, obviously, the stress that can be triggered when you're such a high person, but the peace comes from, but I've done things in integrity. I've done things in a way that promotes my own knowledge and makes me a better expert. And therefore, what I'm doing is I'm providing value to other people, right? So that's a way that peace can come with being highly achieving. And then another thing is that the peace can come from learning sometimes to say no despite being high achieving. So really having a way to, think about, should I really say yes to this even though it sounds like a great idea? Because there's just not enough time in the day. And if I really want to do the things that I've committed to well, then I have to say no to this one thing. And I will say that for myself personally, I've found that balance a little bit easier to achieve and to say no now that I have a child, because things that used to be about, this sounds great and this is something that is definitely something that I care about, now I do have to be a little bit more discerning and say, but there's only so many hours in the day, and I still care about all of these achievements, but I just can't say no. I just can't say yes to every single person, because I really also want to be a present parent. And that's a huge value of mine. So again, just understanding that intersection with your values and your goals, and always, being willing to check into it, because it's going to evolve throughout your life and during different situations.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's something I wanted to just ask is, I guess it goes without saying, the idea that our values do change as our life circumstances change around us. And I love that you're mentioning this thing of balance. I totally want you to elaborate on that, because I know so many of us are constantly struggling with that. We just feel like it's a constant bicycle ride in life, and trying to balance all of the priorities is really challenging.
Definitely. And I think that it can be so hard because there's that part of you that says, there's only so little time that I have left. I have only a finite amount of time to make a mark on this earth, and I have so much that I still want to do. And I totally resonate with that. And I feel all of those things too. But I also just try to remind myself, if I'm not in a good place mentally, physically, I can't accomplish all of these things that I want to. And at some point, people do burn out, no matter how much they love their job. So I think you have to just say, understanding that analogy that I oftentimes talk about with my friends and also with my patients of, there's a reason why when you board a plane, they tell you that you need to secure your mask before you help any people around you. And it's because if you can't breathe, then there's basically nothing left, right? You have to help yourself before you can help other people and achieve the goals in the way that you want. So I think it's really about, really assessing that, understanding the importance of self-care, that it's not a luxury, that it's actually necessary, and knowing that you deserve that self-care. I've talked to people who say, I don't know if I even deserve it really. Maybe that's part of why I feel guilty when I'm doing self-care, because there's so many other things I have to do and there's all these responsibilities, but it's not a luxury. If you don't take care of yourself, then you're not going to be able to do all of the things that you set out to do, and certainly not the quality that you want to do it. And you're going to miss out on the enjoyment of it. You're going to miss out on the present-mindedness of being able to actually enjoy the process on the way to achieving the goals.
So true. So true. I think I heard recently everything comes at a cost. We don't realize that there's a loss involved in everything. And sometimes when we're fixating so heavily on the goals, the things that we want to achieve, we're not realizing that there is something that we need to say no to. So would you say for the people who are stuck with that, what you're saying about keeping your values center right in front of you, let yourself be guided by them, because that is how you're going to live a life on your terms and one that is truly fulfilling and satisfying for you.
Exactly. And I think that a lot of times when you are kind of at a crossroads and you're thinking, should I say yes to this or should I go this way, A or B? Then ask yourself, which of these decisions would allow me to honor my top values the most? And when you can answer that question, then you're not going to regret your decision. You're not going to have that buyer's remorse because you're going to know, well, I checked this through with my values, and this was the decision that helped me to align most with the values that I say I have.
Yeah, totally. I'm going to move into final fast few questions now, Judy. And the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what is something you've had to unlearn in life?
I think something that I had to unlearn is probably this idea that you don't need other people to help you. I think I was a very, very independent person from a very young age. And I oftentimes just thought, I don't really need other people's help. I can just do it myself. And I think that is true. I can do a lot of the things myself, but it's also that, it's important to lean into other people and to ask for support, just because it's helpful to have a community. And it can be really nice to be independent and to know that you can do these things on your own, but why? Why should you do them on your own? What's really the reason behind it? So I would say that is one of the things that I had to unlearn. And it's still hard for me now to ask for help, but I'm trying to be a little bit better about that. And I want to be a good example to the generation after me, to like my younger, cousins who have their children, to my own child. Like, I want them to know it's okay to ask for help and it's not a sign of weakness.
Yes, beautifully said. Secondly, what is a really great piece of advice that you've received in your life that you'd like to share?
I think probably about the fact that no matter how you're feeling, that it's something that is just of this moment and that it will pass. I think that sometimes when we're having overwhelming feelings, it can feel like it's going to just take over and it's going to be like this for a long time. And I think the more you struggle with that, the longer they do linger. But if you just accept that they're there, they kind of leave also sooner. So this idea of not struggling with your emotions, especially the negative ones.
And lastly, what is a closing message that you'd like to give to our listeners who are on this healing and self-development journey?
Well, I would say that it's never too late to change your behavior patterns. It's never too late to believe in yourself. It's never too late to stop self-sabotage. It's never too late to start your self-development. I've worked with people who, for the first time, were coming to therapy in their 70s, and they'll say, is there any hope for me? And my answer is always yes. It's just your willingness to even want to self-improve. That's really all we need. Our brains are incredibly plastic at all ages, even as we get older. And the research shows that. So just know that and believe in yourself and know that there's always a possibility for positive change in your life.
Beautiful. You can start over at any time, people. I had to put that plug in there at the very end. Judy,
absolutely.
Yes. Judy, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and also some of your personal story there, because it's so relatable. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shannon. It was a great time. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
And thank you to all of you listening. I hope you found this episode inspiring, helpful, and thought-provoking. And just a final word from me, high praise to you all for continuously choosing healing, self-awareness, and growth. I totally believe in your ability to make change, surmount challenges, and build a life worth dreaming about.